Hello, my name is Roberto Rocco, and I will talk about the social function of urban land in Brazil. In 1985, Brazil emerged from 20 years of military rule, in which was a remarkably peaceful transition. Strong social movements had emerged in the last phase of the dictatorship. Many of those movements were concerned with a fundamental human right, the right to adequate shelter. They had shaped into politically articulated movements that were able to influence the writing of a new democratic constitution enacted in 1988. Principles of the new constitution were devolution, decentralization, and participation. Municipalities were defined as equal to federal states and the federal union. Municipalities became very autonomous regarding policy making and financing. The new constitution simultaneously recognized the right to property and the social function of property. In its chapter about fundamental rights and guarantees, and again in its chapter about the economic and financial order of the country. In Chapter 2, the new constitution addressed urban policy, stating that urban property fulfills its social function when it complies with the fundamental demands of urban development expressed in a master urban plan, and lists a few tools that may be used to promote that function. So, if an urban landowner does not build or subutilizes urban land, local governments could carry out one or more of the following measures. Compulsory subdivision of the plot, compulsory building, imposition of gradually rising property tax, which we call progressive taxation, and finally, eminent domain, with compensation paid in municipal bonds. To understand the relevance and potential impact of this, let's explore this concept. What is property? The right to own property is one of the pillars of liberal democracies. Other rights include freedom of expression and freedom of association. Liberal democracy is a liberal political ideology and a form of government in which representative democracy operates under the principles of classical liberalism. Most European countries, like the Netherlands, are liberal democracies. But the right to own property is also recognized as a human right. Article 17 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everybody has the right to own property alone as well as in association with others. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. Property is usually considered to be ownership rights to the proceeds generated by the property and control over a resource or good. Many people equate the right to control property or land to the right to do whatever one wants with that property. But this idea is incorrect. The right to own property is not an absolute right, that is, it cannot exist in isolation from other types of rights and independently from the rights of others. For every individual right entails limitations by other rights and by the rights of others. It is important to recognize that this is not a natural construction. People don't naturally have the right to private property as we conceive it in Western democracies. In fact, in many cultures, there is a very different notion of property. For example, Native Americans used to believe that private property did not exist. Native Americans didn't own their land, but were only guardians or custodians of the land. In their original system, they could neither sell nor assign or transmit it to their children. For Australian Aboriginal peoples, the land owns them and every aspect of their lives is connected to it. They have a profound spiritual connection to their land. Now, let's look at these concepts and how they have evolved in history. Plato, the Greek philosopher, in his monumental work, The Republic, argued that collective ownership was necessary to promote the pursuit of the common interests and to avoid the social divisiveness that would occur when some grieve exceedingly and others rejoice at the same happenings. Aristotle, another Greek philosopher, responded by arguing that private ownership promotes virtues like prudence and responsibility. He said, "When everyone has a distinct interest, men will not complain of one another and they will make more progress because everyone will be attending to his own business." For Aristotle, societies would be better served if they focused ethical attention on the way a person exercises his rights of private property, rather than questioning the institution itself. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote about the subject in the Middle Ages in his writings inspired legislation that said, if land remained uncultivated, anyone could sow it and enjoy a third of the produce. The notion of social function of property was much advanced by Hugo de Groot, or Hugo Grotius, the famous Dutch jurist, who wrote extensively about the notion of property. For Hugo, the property of subjects is under the eminent domain of the state, so that the state or he who acts for it may use and even alienate and destroy such property, not only in the case of extreme necessity, in which even private persons have the right over the property of others, but for ends of public utility, to which ends those who founded civil society must be supposed to have intended that private ends should give way. But it is to be added that when this is done, the state is bound to make good the loss to those who lost their property. Here, Hugo is spelling out what we know as eminent domain and fair compensation. In summary, ownership brings social responsibility towards the community. If the owner fails to promote responsible and productive use of their property, or if their property presents challenges for the common good, their ownership should be constrained or even removed. The 1917 Mexican Constitution, enacted during the Mexican Revolution, was the first to recognize the social function of property in modern times in its famous Article 27. It recognized individual property rights, but property rights were to be granted by the nation, who was the original owner of all land. However, there was a clear recognition of the social function of private property. The nation shall at all times have the right to impose on private property such limitations as the public interest may demand, as well as the right to regulate the utilization of natural resources which are susceptible of appropriation, in order to conserve them and to ensure a more equitable distribution of public wealth. Back to Brazil, the instruments provided for by the 1988 Constitution were further detailed in a document titled Statute da Cidade, which is often translated as City Statute, enacted in 2001. Article 39 of the City Statute details what the social function of property is. Urban property fulfills its social function when it fulfills the fundamental demands of city development expressed in the municipal plan. So far, this is identical to the text of the Constitution, but then it follows. Ensuring the fulfillment of citizens' needs in regards to their quality of life, social justice, and the development of economic activity. So, here, the social function of property is equated to the fulfillment of citizens' needs, their quality of life, and social justice. This opens the door for the enactment of very progressive legislation, which aims to ensure that urban land fulfills broad societal goals. Here, the individual right to do whatever one wants with their property is clearly limited. The city statute further details the tools for local administrations to enforce the social function of property, which we listed before. One of those tools, eminent domain with compensation, is very revealing, because the text detailing the tool says that the value of the compensation will follow the tax value of the plot, minus the value added to the plot by the public works carried out in the area where the plot is located. This is a very innovative measure that recognizes that the value of an urban plot is defined by its location in relation to infrastructure and public goods, which were achieved through a communal effort. The city of São Paulo, under the administration of Fernando Haddad, has detailed these progressive tools in its amply illustrated Strategic Master Plan enacted in 2015. Here is an example of how they illustrate the social function of property in the plan. You can find the link to this plan at the end of this presentation. To understand the idea, imagine that I own a plot in the middle of the desert, where there is no infrastructure. The value of the plot is naturally very low. But with all the infrastructure and amenities surrounding my plot, which have been mostly paid by public money, and all the other buildings from other developers, the value of my plot is much higher. To summarize my main point, people have the right to own property. However, property does not exist in isolation, but in context. Urban land is valuable because it is served by infrastructure and services that lie beyond its borders. Infrastructure, services, and amenities are generally paid for with public money. Therefore, individual landowners derive a great part of the value of their land from public goods created by society. By this token, they can be taxed by local authorities accordingly, and so give back to society.